I've had so many questions about my sourdough bread, so today I thought I'd teach you a step-by-step process on how I make it. There are lots of different techniques and tricks that people swear by when making sourdough, but I found that keeping it straightforward works best for me. It makes the whole process a lot less intimidating, and I reckon you'll find it a lot easier than you may have thought. Okay, first step, bring your sourdough starter out of the fridge if you've got it stored in there. Just let it come to room temp for about 2 to 3 hours. That's just gonna help that starter become nice and active. So now the starter's come to room temp, it's time to feed it. I've measured out 60 grams of starter here, and I'm going to feed it at a 1:1:1 ratio. This means I'll add 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water to the starter. I'll mix everything together until it's fully combined. Just make sure you're mixing it thoroughly like I'm doing here, getting all that starter which is stuck at the bottom of the jar. Once you've done that, you can use a small spatula if you've got one to scrape the sides down and clean up the edge of the glass. Place the lid on loosely, then grab a rubber band and place in line where the starter sits so you can see how much it grows. Let it sit at room temperature for about 4 to 6 hours. A few hours later, it should have risen, bubbled up, and just started to flatten or drop a little at the top, like you can see here. This means that it's reached its peak and it's at its most active, ready to use for your dough. Alright, so once your starter is ready, grab a large mixing bowl, add 300 grams of room temperature filtered water, followed by 150 grams of your active starter. Mix everything together until it's well combined. The utensil you see me using is called a dough whisk. This is going to help mix the dough more efficiently, but if you don't have one, that's perfectly fine. You can just use a wooden spoon. Next, add 400 grams of bread flour and 100 grams of whole wheat flour. Then mix until everything comes together. At this stage, your dough will look a little shaggy, and that's perfectly fine. Cover the bowl with a tea towel and let it rest for 30 minutes. This first rest period allows the flour to hydrate and allows the dough to relax before we go to the next step. Once the dough has rested, it's time to add the salt. Add 10 grams of salt to the dough, along with a little bit of water, around about a tablespoon or two, to help dissolve the salt and distribute evenly through the dough. Use your hand and pinch the salt into the dough, making sure it's well incorporated. I like to give the dough a quick knead for about 2 minutes to fully combine that salt. Once that's done, add the dough back into the bowl, cover it with a tea towel and let it rest for another 30 minutes. Now it's time for the first stretch and fold. Using a wet hand, grab the dough, stretch it up and fold it over itself. Do this 4 times to each corner. I like to tuck my hand under the dough to shape it into a ball before resting for another 30 minutes. You're going to repeat this process 2 more times for a total of 3 rounds of stretch and folds. You'll notice the dough becoming more elastic and smooth after the second and third stretch and fold. After the final stretch and fold, you'll let the dough rest, covered with a damp tea towel or plastic wrap. This allows the dough to go through its bulk fermentation stage. This can take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours and sometimes even longer. The time can vary depending on the temperature of your kitchen. In the final stages of your fermentation, prepare your banneton by lining it with the cloth and sprinkling it generously with rice flour. This will stop it from sticking. I find the cloth liner is easier to clean than a flour dusted banneton, as it can be shaken out or washed when needed. After a few hours, your dough should have roughly doubled in size. This process typically takes anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, but the time can vary depending on the temperature of your kitchen. Warmer environments will speed up the fermentation, while cooler kitchens will slow it down. You can always use a food thermometer to check the temperature of the dough through the process. Ideally, a range between 24 to 26 degrees Celsius, which is 75 to 79 degrees Fahrenheit. If your kitchen is quite cold, you can place the dough in the oven with just the light on, no heat, to help adjust the temperatures. Carefully turn the dough out of the bowl onto a clean work surface. From here, begin shaping the dough by gently pulling one side over itself and repeating this motion from all sides until the dough starts to feel tight. Then once the dough has some structure, flip it over so the smooth side is on top, then gently shape it into a ball by cupping your hands around it and pulling the dough towards yourself. This will help create more tension in your dough. Repeat this motion until the dough forms a smooth, tight ball. Use your bench scraper to pick the dough up. As you can see in the video, I'm placing the dough top side down into the banneton. Cover it with a damp tea towel and let it rest for another 20 minutes. After this short rest, give the dough a few more gentle folds and pinches to further build tension. Once you've done that, sprinkle a little more rice flour on top so nothing sticks. Cover the banneton with cling wrap and place it into the fridge to proof overnight. This is called the cold fermentation stage. During this time, the dough will continue to ferment, but at a much slower rate due to the cold temperature. It's going to help enhance the flavour and texture of the bread by allowing the yeast and bacteria to work gradually. It also makes the dough easier to handle and shape when baking the next day. Preheat your oven to 240 degrees Celsius or 460 degrees Fahrenheit with the Dutch oven inside. Take your dough out of the fridge, remove the cling wrap, and as you can see, your dough should have risen a little more. Lay a sheet of baking paper onto your work surface and flip the dough on top of it. Remove the banneton, dust off any excess rice flour, then score the top with a lame or sharp knife. I like to make 2 simple cuts. Make sure your score is deep enough to let your bread rise properly, and your cuts should be at least 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep, and large enough to give the dough room to fully expand whilst baking. Once the oven is preheated, carefully remove the Dutch oven, take off the lid and lift the dough into the pot using the baking paper. Cover the lid and bake for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, remove the lid and check for a nice oven spring. Oven spring is the rapid rise your bread experiences during the first part of baking. Lower the temperature to 210 degrees Celsius or 410 degrees Fahrenheit. Bake for a further 20 minutes with the lid off to develop a beautiful golden crust. Remove from the oven and place onto a wire rack to completely rest. Give yourself at least 1 to 2 hours before slicing. Perfecting your sourdough loaf comes down to balancing time, temperature, and a bit of trial and error. Don't be afraid to make adjustments because sometimes it's those small changes that can make the difference.
Good crust. Soft, fluffy, delicious.
That's it for today's video. If you liked it, leave me a thumbs up, subscribe for more recipes, and if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. I'll see you in the next video.